Our second speaker this morning is Dr. Pooja Agarwal. She's currently a Postdoctoral Research Associate at Washington University St. Louis, conducting memory research at local middle and high schools. She recently served as Illinois' Director of K-12 Assessment, responsible for assessment, development, and administration for 2 million students, implementation of a new statewide growth model, design of Illinois' new accountability system, and the management of a $43 million budget. Dr. Agarwal has teaching experience at the elementary, middle, high school, and university levels, policy experience at the U.S. Department of Education and the College Board, and 10 years of experience in human learning and memory research. Throughout all this work, Dr. Agarwal is dedicated to bridging the gaps between education, teaching, research, and policy. A little known fact about Pooja is that she has a twin brother. And whenever she reveals this to people she's just met, they inevitably ask her if it's an identical or a non-identical twin. While you're thinking about that, please welcome Pooja.
I'm obviously short, so this works better for me. I hope you don't mind. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I just want to say I'm honored to be invited here by McMaster and Joe Kim and David Shore for all their help organizing this symposium, and I especially thank all of you for taking the time out of your schedules to be here and listen to our presentation. And so I will be talking about a specific strategy for learning called retrieval practice that John Dunlosky talked about last night, and Bob mentioned it a little bit in his talk just now. And what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit about retrieval practice, show you some data that we've done in applied classrooms, and then talk about more of the practical side. How do students and teachers implement retrieval practice, and then what are some of those implications? And I just wanted to start by thanking my collaborators who are at Washington University, and all of our funding for the past 8+ years has been from the Institute of Education Sciences, which is sort of the research arm of sorts, like the NSF of education in the United States. And so before I get into retrieval practice, I wanted to start with a demonstration, and I have 2 rules. Don't cheat, and don't shout out the answer, okay? So I'd like you to look at these images, and hopefully you can see them, and I'd like you to figure out which one is the real penny. Now, I understand we're in Canada, so maybe this isn't the best example, but the top 2 pennies are facing, Lincoln is facing to your right, and the bottom 2 is facing to your left, and some of the details are sort of flipped around. So go ahead and take a minute, talk to your neighbor. What do you think? Which one is the real penny? Okay, who says number 1? And number 2? And number 3? And number 4? Great, that works really well. Because obviously, no one really knows which one's the right penny. Or at least we all have lots of different ideas. And of course, I'm sure most people, even if you're Canadian, have spent times looking at pennies, using pennies, carrying them around in your pocket, and especially for, kids have experience with pennies all the way for their entire lives. We see pennies over and over, we use them every day, but half the room says he's facing left and half the room says he's facing right. The correct answer is number 1. You can take out a penny and check. But my point with just this little demonstration, I think, gets at some of the assumptions we make about how we learn and remember. It's a simple cherry-picked example, but the point is that even though we're exposed to pennies over and over and over again with no expectation that we have to sit down and stare at a penny, we still can't remember which one's the real penny. And I think there's this assumption that if we say stuff often enough to students, and if they reread and re-expose themselves often enough, they'll get it. And that's just not how memory works. But students and teachers have this assumption that exposure over time will help us remember. So what do we do instead? And I think, again, going back to some assumptions that teachers and students hold, sort of in the process of learning, we tend to think that we start with learning activities. So I'm going to stand here and talk at you for 30 minutes, and ideally you're going to remember something. Or a student's going to read a chapter from his textbook, or a teacher is going to lecture for 20 minutes and we'll move on to discussion. So there's all this learning that kind of happens, and memory researchers call this encoding. And then we hope that some of this stuff sticks. So we did all these learning activities, Hopefully you'll walk out of this room and remember something. Maybe you'll remember what a penny looks like. But we hope that something sticks. And ideally for educators, we hope that it sticks over the long run, right? And memory researchers typically call this storage. And then we try to figure out, did it work? Did students learn from their textbook? Did they learn from my class? Are they going to get a grade and move on to bigger and better things? And so again, I think in learning, we all assume that here's where learning takes place. And here's where we figure out what we learned. It's as simple as that. And students and teachers continue to think that that's the process. You learn stuff, you remember it, and then I can kind of spit it back out at you. And memory research shows that we need to flip our thinking. Certainly there are some learning activities that need to happen, but 100+ years of research has shown that learning takes place at the retrieval stage. So it's not just this idea that we need to put stuff into our heads to get it to stick to our memory, but what research demonstrates is that we need to get stuff out of our heads and retrieve it in order to get it to stick. And so that's sort of the basic component of retrieval and some other memory strategies that we have studied in labs and in classrooms. But the point is that we need to start thinking about learning in a different way. And actually using our knowledge and retrieving it is what benefits our learning in a variety of ways instead of just kind of being empty teacups that teachers pour tea into. And so I'll briefly go through retrieval practice. You can find plenty of information online, so I won't spend too much time on this. Of course, John Dunlosky and his colleagues' monograph is fantastic and has a great review of retrieval practice. But again, there's this myth that quizzes only assess learning. Nothing happens other than just sort of telling me what you know. And hundreds of years of research tell us that that's false. There's actually learning that takes place during the retrieval act. And there's been lots and lots of studies. I'm not going to go through them, but this retrieval practice strategy is, as we discussed a little bit last night, not only improves factual-based knowledge or memorization, but there has been research to show that it improves students' transfer to new situations, application of knowledge to new scenarios, and some higher-order thinking skills in Bloom's taxonomy, like synthesis and analysis and predicting. And a lot of this research, of course, comes from the laboratory. And I'm just going to show you sort of the basic, simplest study that actually Bob just showed earlier, wherever he is. There he is. But I'll show it in a little different way. So in the same study that Bob mentioned, this was with 180 college students, and students either re-studied a passage over and over and over again, or they studied once and they took 3 quizzes. And an important part of this experiment is that students spent the exact same amount of time, regardless of what group they're in. So they either spent, let's say, 15 minutes rereading over and over and over again, or they spent 15 minutes studying and then taking 3 quizzes. And the researchers were interested in what happens to memory 5 minutes later, but then what happens a week later? Because ideally, we as educators and students want to be able to help us learn in the long run. And so again, as Bob showed, originally in the 5-minute exam, doing all that rereading over and over and over again gets you at about a B level. These students are remembering about 80% of the passage, and if you studied and took 3 quizzes, you're only remembering 70%. But this interesting part of why our assumptions about memory and learning come into play is when you think about the long term, what was learned really quickly and easily in the first place is forgotten super quickly in the long run, or at least in just 1 week. So again, going back to this fluency idea, what seems really easy and comfortable kind of works in the short term, so I think that's why students cram, because they've managed to get good grades and move on. But if we really want students to emphasize long-term learning, again, we need to think about retrieval, getting stuff out of our minds and not just putting stuff in. So the question I've been asking for quite a while now is, does retrieval practice improve learning in middle schools and high schools? With the 100+ years of research on retrieval practice, there have been some studies in schools with students, and there's been some lab research with educational materials, but that's great, but if we really want teachers especially to use this, will it work in the wild, right? So so a few things to think about, at least from either a research perspective or as a consumer of research, is that it's important in applied research to figure out, do these strategies that work in the lab work in real classrooms with real students and real teachers? So in all of our studies, we had classrooms of 20 to 30 students, ranging from special ed to gifted to poor to rich, teachers who had to take breaks because they were sick and they took a sick day, classrooms that were standard American public education classrooms. Of course, we also wanted to emphasize that we were using authentic materials and assessments. We never made up any materials. We took exactly what the teacher was using before we even met them and just sort of controlled and tweaked where we inserted retrieval practice. And then we also wanted to look at authentic retention intervals. A lot of laboratory research looks at memory maybe 2 days later or a week later. Some online experiments have started doing longer delays, but a nice thing about public education in the United States is the students have to come back every day. So we can kind of test their memory over a long period of time and see in authentic settings how long do these strategies improve learning. So in this project, we've been doing research in Columbia, Illinois, outside of St. Louis, and we've been doing research with middle school and high school students in a variety of subject areas. And I won't go through all the research, but we've been in math, science, history, English, Spanish. I'm forgetting something, but we've been in a lot of different subject areas and have shown that retrieval practice helps with most of those subject areas. We've done research with more than 1,500 students over the course of 8 years, and more than 30 experiments, and I can't go through all of them in 30 minutes, so you're going to get cherry-picked pretty graphs that I like, but we do have a list of publications that are available on my website. You can download all of them. We've got many more forthcoming about all of these experiments. And a key component of what we've been doing in the classroom to emphasize retrieval practice is to make sure that it's low stakes. The focus here again is not on retrieval as an assessment, but as a learning tool. So anytime we implemented retrieval practice, it was always in the context of, this doesn't count for a grade. This is just to help you learn. And maybe it'll help the teacher figure out what you know and what you don't know. But, here's some retrieval practice. Go for it. Low stakes, and we always provided feedback. There's a rich literature on how feedback sort of enhances and almost doubles the benefits you get from retrieval practice, so we did always give feedback, but we've played around with different types of feedback and the timing of feedback and so on. And an important component of all of our research is that we use a within student or a within subject design, where instead of us having a classroom that does retrieval practice and a classroom that doesn't, what we've done is take a textbook, let's say a chapter from a 6th grade textbook, and we kind of split it in two. So half of the information from that textbook chapter, the students will get quizzes or retrieval practice on. And half of that information, students will not get quizzes or they'll have the opportunity to restudy. So each student serves as their own control. There are lots of reasons why this is a powerful way of looking at research questions, and ethically it's more comfortable for educators and students because we're not sort of taking one class and giving them something neat and keeping it away from the other class. So everyone is involved in the intervention, but it's very tightly controlled in terms of half the information is quizzed and half is not, and of course we sort of randomize what half that is depending on the 6 classes that we're in and so on and so forth. And again, the question is, what produces better learning on a final exam? Does this retrieval practice or this idea of sort of low stakes quizzing improve learning more than just rereading or kind of business as usual? And our basic design in most of our experiments, we give a pre-quiz before the students have received a lecture from their teacher. The teacher gives her lecture, they get another quiz, and then a few days later they get a review quiz. And each of these quizzes, we mix around the order of items and the alternatives, and we've done this with multiple choice and short answer, and we've done it on clickers, and we do it on paper, and it all kind of works. But we've played around with a lot of these things, but the basic gist is we give 3 quizzes. And we compare this to business as usual, to what if the teacher just teaches her lecture. In both conditions, people still do homework, they still read online, they still do class assignments. The only difference is giving 3 5-minute low-stakes quizzes or no quizzing, or in some cases we have people restudies so that we're controlling for the amount of time on task. John talked about that a little bit yesterday, so I'm not going to go into it today, but We've controlled for time on task and all kinds of stuff like that. So basically the question is, does quizzing help more than standard practice? And again, in terms of this idea of authentic retention intervals, we're able to look not at just how students perform at the end of their learning about the chapter on ancient Egypt, but do they still remember that information at the end of the semester, and then what about at the end of the school year? And so I'm going to go through 3 basic research questions. Again, we've experimented on a lot of other questions, so I kind of cherry-picked these ones, but I think they're important in answering some research questions as well as some applied questions for students and educators. So again, the first one is we just want to make sure, does retrieval practice work in a classroom, and does it work over the long run? Because again, there's been plenty of lab research, but it hasn't been in classroom settings where you've got snow days and fire drills and absences and coughing and whatever. And we want to make sure that this lasts for a long time. The second question I'm going to go through is what type of quiz or exam is important? Do I have to do retrieval practice in multiple choice format? Can I just give kids a blank piece of paper and ask them to write down everything they know? Do I have to give them a prompt? Should it be fill in the blank? And then what about the final exam? Does the final exam have to also match multiple choice, or can it be different, or what? So I'll go through that study in a minute. And then a big question that teachers and parents often ask us is, this retrieval practice sounds interesting. It kind of sounds like testing, like John mentioned yesterday. Isn't this really anxiety-provoking for students? And so I'm going to present some data we have about whether or not retrieval practice causes test anxiety. So I'll start with our first research question. Does retrieval practice improve long-term classroom learning? And in this study, we included 139 8th grade students on science topics from the teacher's textbook. And again, we did 3 short quizzes versus sort of business as usual. And in this study, we did all the questions were multiple choice, and it was a mixture of fact and inference questions. And I'm simplifying the design, but you can read more details in the paper online. Importantly, from our perspective and from the teacher's perspective, there were no other changes structurally. Lesson plans didn't change, exams didn't change, none of that changed. It was just simply inserting 3 5-minute quizzes versus not. And I'll skip straight to the punchline, which is at the end of the chapter, so sort of, after about 2 or 3 weeks of studying a chapter, retrieval practice shows a huge boost. 3 5-minute quizzes improve students' grades from a C+ to an A with just a 5-minute intervention. And at the end of the semester, that difference is still significant. Of course, students have forgotten information, but that 7% difference is still statistically significant. And even at the end of the school year, it's only a 4% difference. 6. It's still statistically significant. It's not as good as we'd like to see, but hey, for a 5-minute intervention, this sounds like something that is easy to implement that may pay off in the short run and in the long run. And so I'll quickly go on to the next research question. What kind of retrieval practice do I have to give? And as John mentioned yesterday in his talk, there has been laboratory research demonstrating that if retrieval practice is more challenging, you get a bigger boost. So if you really have to recall information and sort of output it in an essay, that seems to benefit students more than multiple choice exams. So we wanted to look at that in the classroom. And so in this, we did the study with 78 high school students on American history, and here we just used 2 quizzes versus business as usual, again, low stakes with feedback. And we gave students multiple choice or short answer quiz questions, and then we also gave them multiple choice or short answer exam questions. And so in your head, you can kind of draw lines between the different combinations of conditions, but students could have a multiple choice quiz and a multiple choice exam, or a multiple choice quiz and a short answer exam, and so on. And again, lesson plans, exams, homework, all stayed the same. So skipping straight to the punchline, on the y-axis, just as before, I've got how students performed. On the bottom, I've got how students performed on the sort of final multiple choice exam, and then how they performed on the short answer exam. So first, I'm going to go through how they performed on the multiple choice exam, depending on the type of quizzing or retrieval practice that they were engaged in. So if students got multiple choice quizzes, they're doing pretty well on their final exam, at a 90% for high school students learning American history. And surprising to us, if students got a short answer exam, they're doing really well on this multiple choice exam too. So it's not as though the questions have to be the same, and teachers often ask, well, this retrieval practice is kind of like teaching at the test. You're just giving the same questions over and over and over, but you don't have to. You can give different questions, and we've done this wording questions differently as well, but you can give questions in a completely different format, and students can still perform well with retrieval practice, of course, compared to business as usual. And we've got more experiments in this paper with longer retention intervals and so on. But how do students do on the short answer exam? So if I'm a teacher and I want to give a short answer exam, which kind of retrieval practice should I use? If students got a multiple choice quiz, they're remembering about 73% on the short answer exam. Now, the simple drop in performance isn't surprising to memory researchers just because short answer exams are by nature harder. With multiple choice, you kind of have a 1 in 4 chance or a 1 in 5 chance of figuring out the right answer. So students aren't performing as well, but they're still doing pretty good. And if students got a short answer quiz, they do well on the short answer exam. But if they got no quizzing, they're failing. They're not remembering anything from American history. And this is somewhat counterintuitive to work that's been done in the lab, which shows that short answer quizzing really improves long-term learning. And so this was surprising to us, but it actually is kind of a nice story to tell teachers, do whatever quizzing is convenient. Multiple choice is a bit objective, but it takes a while to write good multiple choice questions. Short answer is super easy to write, but it's really subjectively graded, and it's hard to grade consistently. But hey, do whatever works for you. It doesn't matter. You still show benefits of retrieval practice. And so the third question, does retrieval practice increase test anxiety, is something that I think the schools were worried about when we first started our project. And the parents and other schools and teachers around the country all have this question. You're giving them these uncomfortable quizzes over and over and over again. We know that students don't like to study this way because it's uncomfortable. Aren't you increasing test anxiety, especially for young middle school and high school students? So in this study, it wasn't an experimental study, but this is a study we've done for our entire project with 1,410 6th through 12th grade students. And we gave a survey at the end of the year about student study preferences and what they thought about clickers. And again, our data were collected over the 6 years. We didn't follow students from grade level to grade level, but we did sort of implement this survey at the end of every academic year. And all students who participated in the survey did participate in retrieval practice or in clicker quizzes, and so it's not as though we can say that we have survey data for students who did retrieval practice versus students who didn't. Every student in the survey did retrieval practice, so we don't have a good control group, but we can ask students, were you more anxious in this class that had retrieval practice compared to your other classes that didn't have retrieval practice? And so our first question was, did clicker quizzes make you more or less nervous? Simple, straightforward. And 67% of students said it makes me less nervous. It doesn't make me more nervous, it makes me less nervous. Only 4% said more. And we think this is because as students are learning from retrieval practice, they're learning, right? And so they don't have to study as hard for the exam. They know kind of what to expect on the exam. They've retrieved information from their minds, and so they're comfortable with the idea of retrieving again on an exam. How anxious were you in this class compared to other classes? 48% said, about the same. I wasn't really anxious in this class, and I wasn't more anxious in the class without retrieval practice. That's only 19%, and 33% say less. So all this retrieval practice in this class, a third of students said, that actually made me less nervous in this class. And we have self-reported numerical data of asking students how long they studied in this class versus others. Students studied less, for a lower amount of time than they studied in other classes. So again, I think students are becoming comfortable with this idea of retrieval, and these experiments were implemented year-long, so it's not just sort of one static intervention and then we ask this question. It's kind of a cultural change that I think these students were realizing. Did clickers help you learn? Of course, us as researchers know that they did. We phrased this in such a way because a lot of retrieval practice we did was with personal response systems or clickers where everyone had a remote. But did they help you learn? We know that's true, but students and teachers often don't pick up on this because, as Bob talked about and John talked about, we're not aware of what we learn best from. But 80% of students said yes. They helped me learn. 7% said no, and 13% said no response. But students are aware that this helps me learn. Interestingly, we asked, was there anything you didn't like about clickers or retrieval practice, even if it helped you learn? And this was a little surprising, but 50% of students said they were boring. And we had some students who really liked doing clicker questions. It's engaging, and you're using technology, and you get to see feedback immediately, and you get to see your scores. 57% of students said, I'm glad I learned, but it's kind of boring. So maybe there's some aspect of tweaking the kinds of questions or how you use retrieval practice in classrooms, but I think it's interesting to know how students are reacting to this intervention. And so in terms of my 3 research questions, again, does retrieval practice improve long-term classroom learning? We've shown that yes, it does, even at the end of a full school year. What type of quiz or exam format is most beneficial in classroom studies that we replicated with numerous experiments and subjects and different grade levels and different content areas? Surprising to us, you see retrieval practice benefits either way. You don't see a bigger boost for short answer or for multiple choice. It doesn't matter if the exam matches or mismatches, you still see a boost in learning compared to no quizzing. And does retrieval practice increase test anxiety? And again, it's just survey self-reported data, but students, 80% of students said it helped them learn, and the majority of students said it made them less nervous. And so now I'd like to just move on to, so to reiterate, make sure you're thinking of retrieval as a learning tool. Again, it's sort of this different way of thinking about how we learn. We're not just kind of empty slates or tape recorders that need things inputted to us, and I can lecture at you and you'll remember it all. Maybe lectures help, I don't know. But from our studies and from retrieval practice research, there's this element of getting stuff out. You have to retrieve it, not just encode it. And there are lots of theories about how this works and sort of the feedback loop idea of encoding retrieval influences, further encoding, and so on and so forth. But it's just thinking about things differently. Or simply put, it's kind of like the old saying, practice makes perfect. Or you have to use it or you lose it. And sometimes when we talk about our research with teachers, it's really interesting because some teachers think this is all intuitive. If you think about math teachers, they do retrieval practice all the time. They may block and not interleave, and that's a whole other situation. But kids do a lot of practice problems in math. And in John's example, if you have a dance recital, you're not really going to cram the night before a dance recital, but you're also not going to watch videos of someone else dance and then be expected to perform yourself, right? So it's a different way of thinking about getting students to use their knowledge to then sort of promote further learning. And so just some practical tips, whether you're a student or a teacher, is to provide frequent low-stake quizzes. Again, all of our work was with low-stake or no-stake quizzes. And as John discussed, you kind of want to space these out over time. So frequent quizzes are good as opposed to a 20-minute long quiz. We just did 3 or 2 5-short-minute quizzes. The more the better. We haven't exhausted this yet, but you also don't want to just kind of keep quizzing students. At some point, they need a break. But in general, we found that in the classrooms, the more retrieval practice you give, the better, especially if you're revisiting prior content and kind of going back to this idea of successive relearning. Space retrieval practice over time. Again, always provide feedback. It's good to help students retrieve, but there's a whole other kit and caboodle of what happens if you provide feedback. Students can retrieve, but then they have no idea if they got it right or wrong. And so this is an important component that I think is difficult and something that needs to be thought about, especially at a higher education level. If professors are giving quizzes in class, they often don't want to sort of release their test banks or give students back their quizzes because then they could keep them and pass them on to other students and so on and so forth. But there is research to support that feedback is a really important component of retrieval practice. And I didn't show any data to support this, but we have it. Give a variety of quiz questions. So as someone asked yesterday, this just sounds like a bunch of memorization. Well, it turns out it depends on the kind of question you ask. If you ask a fact-based question, students do well on a fact-based exam. If you ask a case-based or a prediction scenario, then students do really well on making predictions on a final exam. So it depends on how you use retrieval practice. It doesn't necessarily only improve memorization. And of course, encourage students to quiz themselves. Flashcards are super easy. There are lots of free apps. There's lots of research now about how to best optimize flashcard learning, because students make bad assumptions and they drop things too quickly. But of course, flashcards are sort of the easiest way to do this for students. And going back to a lot of what John and Bob said, we just need to keep in mind that as students and educators, what seems to be easy, that we're learning really quickly, we forget really fast. And alternatively, what's slower and more difficult is what improves our learning much more potent and durable over the long run. And 3 tips to sort of keep in mind that I think are important in terms of applying this strategy in the classroom is, as Bob and John have mentioned, fluency is a bad predictor. We as humans think that, oh, I know this now, so I'm going to know this 10 days from now. Or I just restudied that chapter 5 times, I'm going to ace my exam tomorrow. And lots of research shows that we're just bad at making predictions based on our own performance. And because this is difficult, students and teachers may not want to do this. It's not comfortable. And because it's not comfortable, you kind of get the feeling that you're not learning, so you sort of drop that strategy. And so I think we as teachers and students need to think more and think and question the assumption that learning is easy. Learning's not easy, especially if you want to remember things and use it in the future. We need to invest some extra effort and some structural changes to ensure that students are using and retrieving information. And I was going to go through some implications, but I'm out of time. So if anyone is interested in talking to me, of course, everyone in this room has 20 plus years of experience being a student. Educators, I am a former teacher, and so I like thinking about how to implement things on a practical level. Researchers, I think applied research is an important component of something researchers need to think about. Policymakers, there are obvious implications I'd be happy to talk about. And others, I just want to mention that retrieval practice and a lot of what we're talking about doesn't just apply to education. So what about job training? Walmart is the biggest employer in the world. They have a lot of training and a lot of employees. If they got their employees to remember stuff better, imagine that they don't have to keep retraining them. Or another problem, and there's research about medical education with med students and residents, but what about patient education? If a patient comes in for a surgery and a doctor says, you do this and this and this, and they send you home, studies show that patients just don't follow instructions. And part of that is because it's hard to change behavior, but I think part of that is because people just don't remember what the doctor said. And so I think there are important implications of changing our assumptions and the way we think about learning for areas outside of the education field. We're going to have more information, practical tips, research, et cetera, online available soon. Thank you.